So in the level, we have this door here. First of all, the door is actually a static mesh and can't move. So before we even start to script anything, we need to make sure that the door can move. If you select the three parts for the door, and you look in the right side in the details window, you can see it says mobility static. Change that to movable. You can also see if I go to wireframe, it's greenish blue. If we change it to movable, it becomes purple. Now it's purple. Purple means the mesh can move. The green meshes, they can't move, they're static. They will always remain in place. But purple ones, they can be changed during the gameplay. So they can be made hidden, they can be made to grow in size, rotate, move, and so on. I'm also going to close the door by default because it's open right now. So let's just close that back. Ignore the fact that the lightning goes dark. If you later on rebuild and might need some extra lights and such as well, it will eventually be resolved. So I'm actually just going to work in unlit mode. Like that. And so this is a door that has three halves and they all slide open. The top half is supposed to slide up, this should slide left, and this should slide right. Okay, so in the level blueprint, I'm going to remove everything I made. And then I'm going to add a begin play again. I'm going to say at the beginning of the game, the door should open. Then I'm going to select one of the door halves here. So I have one of the door halves selected, and then I need to get that part to show up in blueprint. So if I select something in the level and then go back to blueprint and right click, the object I have selected in the level will show up in the right click menu. So I can add a reference to this mesh. This object is now the mesh in the level. I can test that if I were to right click on the thing, and then I can do find actor in level, and you can see it selects the door. So we're going to start with just one part of the door first, and what we need to do in order to move it is we need to move it, we need to tell it to update its location. So we need to have it gently transition from one point in a 3D space to another point. And the way we can do that is if we drag from here, let go, and you do set location. I'm going to do set actor location, and I get this thing. If I were to connect it like so, then the moment I would start playing the game, the door would be gone because it would instantly be teleported basically to this location. That wouldn't be very good though. I wanted to gradually move to this new location, to a different location. There's a different, as with most things in script and these kind of systems, there's a lot of different ways of setting this up. Following is my own way that I always apply. So there's different ways of doing this, but this is how I like to do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag from here to there. I'm going to add a lerp, linear interpolate for a vector. And you get this. What this basically is, and a vector for your information for people who are new to the whole concept, a vector is nothing more but three numbers. Therefore, it identifies a location in a 3D space. It's just X, Y, Z. That's it. A float, which are green, vectors are vectors are orangish yellow. Floats are green. Floats are just single numbers with a decimal point. Vectors are basically three floats in one. That's it. So what this is it says this is the first location, the location where the mesh is right now, and this is the location where it should move to. So it will go from this to that based on what this number is. And this number I'm going to set as a percentage. So if this is 0%, it hasn't moved. If this is going to be 1, 1 should be read as 100%. If this is 1, then it will use this, and then it will end up at a new location. So let's try. What I will therefore do is I will copy the location the mesh is at right now, which is minus 312. (736) for Y and 590 for Z, and then let's say Y and Z should remain the same because it's going to move on the x-axis, and I know it's going to be moving on the x-axis because it's the red arrow here, The red arrow stands for the x-axis, the green for y, and blue for z. So I know it's going to move there. In fact, it's minus 312 now, so you can just check. If I move it here, it would be minus 24. So I'm going to type minus 24 here. And then that would work, except for the fact that this is still 0. So somehow this should become 1. And the way we're going to solve that is by adding a timeline. People coming from Unreal Engine 3, there are still matinees as well, but matinees are now separate actors, and they're mostly used for cutscenes or also for moving level geometry, but the focus moved away a bit from them. Matinees are separate actors, they're no longer embedded within Kismet, or in this case Blueprint, etc. So there's a new system instead, which is called a timeline, which replaces a lot of the functionality that a matinee had in Unreal Engine 3. So I always work with those instead. So I'm going to add a timeline here. You can name it if you want to. You could name it a door animation or so. I'm going to say at the beginning of the game, it should play from start. And while it plays, it should continuously update this thing. So it will keep setting actor location while it plays. And then we still need to have the alpha. It can't really go anywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click the timeline, and then you get the timeline editor. This is similar to how Matinee works in Unreal Engine 3. Double click a Matinee, you get the Matinee editor. So you have these tabs here. So now I'm inside the timeline. I need to add a track. So I have these buttons here at the top. You have a float track and a vector track. And some other things I don't tend to use a lot. I'm simply going to add a float, because this is green here, this needs a float. So I'll add that. You could name it again. You don't really have to, so I'm not gonna do that. You can zoom out here, and you can see this lighter gray area. That's the animation. There's a red line going through it. If you shift click the red line twice at two different locations, you get 2 points. You can just click and drag them around. This is your animation. This represents a number. So you can see what you want to do is you want to set the first number at 0, 0. There's these 2 small boxes there that you can use to set the number more precisely than dragging. So select the number, click once, and set 0, 0. And now it's at exactly 0, 0. So it's at 0 seconds into the animation, and the value is 0. Okay, so the height represents the value of the number it outputs, and the horizontal line here represents time. So here you can see 5. This means 5 seconds into the animation. This is the length of the animation. So the second one will go to 5 seconds in time. So I typed 5 in the first box, and in the second box I type 1. Therefore, we now have a number that will go from 0 to 1 over 5 seconds. That means that at 2.5 seconds halfway through, the value will be 0.5. It gradually moves there. You can see this is now the output of the track. So every time you add a track, a new output will appear on the right side of the timeline, which you then can connect to other things. In this case, I'm going to connect it to the alpha. And if I now play this, the door should open. And you can see the door is opening. So we have a very, very basic door. As a next step, we don't want the door to open when the level starts. We don't want the door to open when something happens in the level. Later on, that's going to be the pressure plate. So when you use the pressure plate, it will open the door. But to begin with, we're going to stick to opening the door when you touch a trigger. So we need to have a trigger here on the ground. And when the player walks into the trigger, then the door will open. On the left side, you have these words here, keywords here. There is something called, for example, basic. And there you have a box trigger. So category basic, and use a box trigger. Or if you want a sphere or capsule trigger, drag one of those in. There we go. And then you can change the size on the right side. It says here box extent. So that's the size of the trigger. You can see the little frame around it. That's the trigger area. So let's just make it a little bit bigger, something like so. Actually, let's place it in the space between the two walls here. If this were to be a real level, you would always want to make sure that the players can't avoid a trigger, or especially in this kind of case. So now I have a trigger here. If you walk through the box, it is supposed to open the door. While I have the trigger selected, I'm going to go back to Blueprint. I'm going to delete the event begin play. I'm going to right click. Now I could add a reference to trigger box 1, but that doesn't really help me. So I'm not going to add a reference to trigger box 1. I'm actually going to add an event for trigger box 1. And in this category, you could then say, for example, you have a couple of different ones, as you can see. These are all the different events you can play on the trigger. Add on actor begin overlap is probably the easiest. That simply means when something walks into it, when something begins to overlap the trigger, which is what the player will do because the player will walk into the trigger box. You can see here, now we have an on actor begin overlap for the trigger box. And that connects to play from start. Let's try that. So the door remains closed. I'm now going to walk into the trigger and the door opens. So I've made a basic trigger. In the same way, you could have done a couple of other basic things with a trigger. So just as a means of introduction, I'm going to do a couple of basic things here. Let me add a particle, for example, in the folder environment fx, general fx, you got a couple of particles, most notably a fire. So let's try to add the fire here. Added a fire. If you had to press Ctrl R in case you don't see the fire, you can make the game start in real time. It's also over there. And you can see the fire is burning. So let's say that when you touch the trigger, we want the door to open and we want fires to begin burning. Therefore, the fire should be off by default. And to turn the fire, it's a particle, to turn the particle off by default, look in the details panel and look for auto activate. I'm going to turn that off, meaning the particle is now off when the game starts. The trigger will then turn it on. So I'm going back to Blueprint. The particle is selected still. I right click here, I'm going to add a reference. So when you want something done as an event, then you would add it as an event, but in all other cases I usually just add a reference and then go from there, right click again and find what I need. In this case what I need is activate, which will activate a particle. Again, make sure you really click and drag from the right places. If I would have just right clicked somewhere and I would have done activate, then I might not find what I need. For example, there is an activate here. Actually, it still takes the one selected, so let's say I don't have anything selected. Right click, activate, and you don't find it. So having the right thing selected and clicking from the right place is really key to making Blueprint work. Right, so I have this, I will just click and drag and place it somewhere. I could place it here and do this, but it's not the most ideal setup because this is executed all the time. This thing is triggered all the time while this plays. I don't want my particle to be turned on all the time while it plays, so I'm actually going to connect it to finished. When the door is done opening, then you can activate the particle. And in the same way, let me actually add a light right away as well. In a similar setup. Section lights, point light, click and drag into the scene. Make sure the light is set to movable, so mobility movable. And I'm actually going to take away use inverse squared fall off. You don't really have to do this, but I think it's much easier to work with. Therefore, also the intensity has to be scaled down a lot. So I'm going to scale the intensity back down to 20 or so. And then I want to make sure the light is off by default. So somewhere in here it says visible, and visible actually means on or off for a light. So I'm going to set it not visible, therefore the light is off. Again, same thing here. Go back to Blueprint. I have the light selected in the viewport. I can do add reference to point light, or actually I can also just go directly in here, rendering is visible, or set visibility. In this case you want to set visibility, and the new visibility will be enabled. So I enable this one over here and connect it to after the particle is activated. If I were to play this, then I should get a light and I should get a particle that begins. So both the particle and the light should activate if I now walk into the trigger and when the door has opened. And that works, light turned on and the fire started. You can see there's a problem here. I walked into the trigger again and it basically restarts the door. That could have been prevented if I would have done not play from start, but simply play. If it's play, it will never execute again because it's already at the end of its life, so it can't continue and therefore nothing happens. So now I have a very basic setup, but this is still not very ideal. This is quite manually done. So also, let's say if you have a level with 20 doors, we would have to set this up 20 times, time after time after time again. And that's not what Blueprint is about. So this is a very Unleashed tree-like setup where we do everything in the blueprint of the level. Much more powerful and also a bit more complicated. Therefore, I would advise if you're new to Blueprint, you probably want to stick to the level blueprint in the beginning just to get the hang out of the system before moving on to the more complex ones. But in order for us to move on now, what we're going to do is we're going to make this door its own actor, its own object. So every time when we have a level that needs a door, we can place the door in the level ready-made, including the triggers, including the animations, including sounds, including everything is combined in one object that you can just click and drag into the scene and you have a working door. Also, the setup we have over here has some issues. For example, with this, we typed in the location of the object, but let's say that at some point we're moving the level to a different location, then we would have to go through Blueprint and update these numbers everywhere, and that wouldn't be very user-friendly. So all of that we can work around if we start doing it in a more complex way with Blueprint objects or assets. So I'm going to start doing that. I'm going to remove everything we have in here. I no longer need any of this. And I'm going to set it up in a standalone blueprint.